The attic air, heavy with the ghosts of forgotten seasons and the subtle decay of time, hung still around me. I had ascended the creaking stairs on a mundane mission, tasked with retrieving a box of old tax documents, yet the universe, it seemed, had other plans. Sunlight sliced into sharp golden beams by the grimy window panes, illuminated dancing motes of dust, each a tiny, silent witness to the passage of decades. My fingers, accustomed to the familiar textures of varnished wood and smooth paper, instead grazed something rough and brittle beneath a forgotten pile of yellowed linens. It was an album, not one of the grand, leather-bound tomes that graced our living room coffee table, filled with smiling ancestors and carefully staged holiday gatherings. This was smaller, unassuming. Its dark cover faded to a ghostly gray, its spine cracked and threatening to surrender its contents entirely. A strange premonition, cold and sharp, pricked at the back of my neck. I lifted it, feeling the surprising weight of history in my hands, a weight far greater than its modest size suggested. There were no gilded titles, no embossed family crests, just a blank, scarred surface that whispered of secrets. With a slow, deliberate breath, I opened it. Inside, the pages were thick, sepia-toned cardstock, many of them empty, others holding only faded shadows where photographs once lay. It was a testament to neglect, a forgotten repository of moments deemed unworthy, or perhaps too dangerous to remember. And then, there it was. Tucked into a corner of the last page, held precariously by a single rusty photo corner, was the image. It wasn't large, perhaps only 3 by 5 inches, but its impact was monumental, a silent explosion in the quiet stillness of that dusty attic. The photograph was fragile, almost translucent, its edges curled like ancient parchment, threatening to crumble at the slightest touch. Yet, despite its delicate state, the clarity of the image was chilling, undeniable. It was the air in Willow Creek always felt heavy with history, a sweet, humid weight that clung to every oak branch and whispered through the long grass of the old cemetery. This was a southern town, steeped in traditions as deep and winding as the river that bordered its eastern edge. At its very heart, both geographically and culturally, lay the Haven, our ancestral plantation. For generations, it wasn't just a place, it was the bedrock of our identity, the gleaming jewel in the crown of local lore. Every child born here learned its story almost with their mother's milk, a tale of industrious prosperity, of a sprawling estate built by visionary ancestors who fostered a unique, almost familial bond with everyone who lived and worked on its fertile lands. It was a narrative of harmonious living, a model of what a southern plantation could be, rather than what many truly were. This meticulously curated version of the Haven wasn't just passed down. It was woven into the very fabric of our daily lives. The local historical society, founded by my own great-grandfather, held annual galas on the plantation grounds, celebrating its legacy of innovation and community spirit. School field trips routinely toured the manicured gardens and stately manor house, where docents, often distant relatives, recounted anecdotes of benevolent stewardship and groundbreaking agricultural practices. Even the town's main street, lined with quaint boutiques and a bustling general store, bore names of families directly descended from the original plantation owners or their most trusted managers, reinforcing a lineage of virtue and success. Every Sunday after church, families would gather for potlucks, and invariably, conversations would drift back to the good old days at the Haven, painting vivid pictures of a bygone era of elegance and mutual respect, a golden age that felt almost mythological in its perfection. I grew up inhaling this narrative, accepting it as irrefutable truth. The sprawling white columns, the scent of magnolias in bloom, the gentle hum of cicadas on a summer evening, all of it conspired to create an idyllic tableau in my young mind. The Haven wasn't just a plantation. It was a testament to our family's honor, a beacon of southern gentility. I remember sitting on my grandmother's lap, her voice soft as she described the bustling harvest festivals, the joyful Christmas celebrations, and the unwavering loyalty of everyone connected to the estate. She spoke of how our ancestors provided for their workers, built schools, and ensured everyone had a place and purpose. These stories weren't just history, they were moral lessons, shaping my understanding of family, community, and responsibility. They were the foundation upon which I built my own identity, a proud descendant of those who had supposedly crafted such a remarkable legacy. Local customs further solidified this idealized image. The annual Haven Heritage Festival wasn't merely a celebration. It was a reaffirmation of our collective memory. We would dress in period attire, reenact scenes of bountiful harvests, and listen to old spirituals that, in this sanitized context, sounded like hymns of contentment rather than cries of endurance. The town's social circles, tight-knit and steeped in generations of shared history, revolved around this central myth. To question the Haven was to question Willow Creek itself, to challenge the very foundations of our collective pride. It felt impenetrable, a fortress of carefully constructed sentiment and tradition, guarded by the unspoken agreement of an entire community. The narrative was so deeply ingrained, so universally accepted, that it became a part of the air we breathed, the water we drank. It was simply the way things were. Yet, even in my youth, beneath the polished veneer of perfection, there were subtle dissonances, almost imperceptible tremors in the carefully constructed facade. I remember specific instances, fleeting moments that pricked at the edges of my innocent acceptance. Once, while exploring a dusty corner of the plantation's old library, I stumbled upon a brittle, leather-bound ledger. Its pages, filled with cramped, faded script, spoke of transactions and inventories that seemed starkly detached from the benevolent descriptions I'd been fed. There were numbers, cold and precise, detailing human beings as property, a reality that my grandmother's stories had always glossed over with vague references to workers and families. The contrast was unsettling, a quiet hum of unease that I couldn't quite articulate then, but which lingered, a tiny unanswered question mark in the back of my mind. Another memory surfaces, a hushed conversation I overheard between my great-aunt Beatrice and an elderly neighbor, both women with eyes that held centuries of stories. They spoke in low tones about things best left buried, about secrets that wouldn't stay quiet forever, and then abruptly changed the subject when they saw me approach, their smiles tight and unconvincing. These were not direct challenges to the narrative, but rather subtle shadows, fleeting glimpses behind the curtain. Why the hushed tones? Why the sudden shift? My young mind filed them away as curiosities, not threats, but they were there, forming a quiet skepticism that was always present, a faint, persistent whisper against the roar of the official history. It was a feeling that something wasn't quite right, a sense of an unspoken truth lurking just beyond the periphery of our carefully managed historical tableau. This pervasive, unchallenged myth of the Haven's perfection, coupled with the societal pressure to uphold it, gradually emerged as the initial, almost subconscious antagonist in my life. It wasn't a person, but an invisible force, a collective agreement to look away from uncomfortable truths. It was the weight of generations of romanticized history pressing down, shaping perceptions, and silencing dissent. The photograph, now discovered, was not merely an old picture. It was a physical manifestation of these long-held doubts, a stark visual contradiction to everything I had been taught, and everything my community believed. It was the first undeniable crack in the fortress, promising to shatter the illusion that had defined my world for so long, and its silent challenge was already beginning to resonate deep within me. The comfortable lie was about to face its reckoning, and I, unknowingly, was holding the key. My own lineage was inextricably woven into the very fabric of the Haven, a connection that ran deeper than mere land ownership. It was a bloodline steeped in the mythology of the perfect plantation. Generations before me had not just lived there, they had defined themselves by it, crafting a narrative of benevolent stewardship and industrious prosperity that became the cornerstone of our family identity. This story wasn't just told, It was embodied. Every portrait on the wall, every antique piece of furniture passed down, every faded photograph in a leather-bound album, all served as silent, tangible anchors to this idealized past. Sunday dinners were less about shared meals and more about the ritualistic recounting of ancestral virtues, tales of my great-great-grandfather's innovative farming techniques, or my great-grandmother's legendary generosity towards her staff. These stories, polished smooth by time and repetition, were the very air we breathed, shaping our understanding of who we were and where we came from. One of the most potent of these anchors was the annual Harvest Festival, a tradition our family had upheld for over a century, ostensibly celebrating the bounty of the haven and the community's enduring spirit. As a child, I saw it as a joyous occasion, filled with music, elaborate feasts, and tales of past festivals where everyone, from the family matriarchs to the field hands, supposedly celebrated in harmonious unison. We had a specific silver punch bowl, a family heirloom, always brought out for the festival, polished to a blinding sheen, its tarnished history carefully ignored. It was said to have been a gift from a grateful former worker, a testament to the family's fairness and kindness. But even then, a faint, almost imperceptible dissonance existed for me. Why were the stories always so one-sided? Why did the narratives of those grateful workers always come from our mouths, never from theirs? As I grew older, these subtle inconsistencies began to prick at the edges of the polished narrative. I'd overhear snippets of conversation from older relatives, hushed tones about an uncle who disappeared, or a sudden change in crop yields that was never fully explained. There was the anecdote about the Great Fire that supposedly destroyed a significant portion of the plantation's early records, an event always recounted with a sigh of regret for the lost history, rather than any genuine curiosity about its cause or impact. These were not outright contradictions, but rather uncomfortable omissions, like missing puzzle pieces that, when mentally inserted, created a vastly different picture than the one proudly displayed. I remembered my grandfather, a man of quiet authority, once referring to a particular wing of the old manor as the servants' quarters, but his eyes would always dart away, and his voice would drop to an almost inaudible murmur, an uncharacteristic shyness that spoke volumes without uttering a single damning word. My attempts to gently probe these gaps were consistently met with a polite yet firm deflection. A casual question about the Great Fire might be met with a dismissive wave of the hand and a quick change of subject to the weather or current town gossip. Inquiries about the specific lives of those who worked the fields were met with vague generalities about their loyalty and dedication, never delving into individual stories or personal histories. There was an unspoken rule, a palpable discomfort that descended when the conversation veered too close to the unexamined past. My great-aunt Eleanor, a formidable woman who held court with an iron will and a porcelain smile, would simply clear her throat and fix me with a look that communicated more effectively than any direct reprimand that such topics were simply not discussed. It wasn't hostility, not overtly, but a subtle, pervasive form of emotional resistance that chilled any burgeoning curiosity. Yet, amidst this carefully constructed silence, there were fleeting moments of revelation, often from the most unexpected sources. My great-aunt Beatrice, a distant cousin who lived on the periphery of our family's inner circle, was a woman of eccentric habits and an unsettling candor. She possessed a sharp wit and a tendency to speak her mind, often much to the chagrin of her more conventional relatives. During one particularly stifling family gathering, as the usual eulogies to our ancestors' benevolence flowed around the dining table, Beatrice, with a glint in her eye and a conspiratorial whisper, leaned close to me. "They only tell you what they want you to hear, dear," she murmured, her voice raspy. "There are things best left unsaid, yes, but also things that must be said, eventually." She never elaborated, never offered specifics, but her words, delivered with such knowing weariness, planted a seed of deeper suspicion within me, a quiet affirmation that my unease was not unfounded. Her fleeting comments, often dismissed by others as the ramblings of an old woman, resonated with a profound truth that chipped away at the polished facade. These early experiences, the subtle evasions, the uncomfortable silences, and the rare, cryptic hints, collectively formed the initial cracks in the otherwise impenetrable narrative. Long before the physical discovery of the photograph, an internal conflict had already begun to brew within me. I was caught between the love for my family and the growing, undeniable sense that the history I had been taught was incomplete, perhaps even deliberately distorted. The Haven, once a symbol of pride and belonging, was slowly transforming in my mind into a place shrouded in shadows, its celebrated past concealing a truth that begged to be unearthed. The beautiful stories, once comforting, now felt like a heavy cloak, hiding something vital and unsettling beneath. This quiet internal struggle, this nascent quest for an unvarnished truth, would ultimately define my path forward. The quiet internal struggle, that nascent quest for an unvarnished truth, began to manifest in more tangible ways as the years progressed. My questions, once subtle and tentative, grew more pointed, and with their increased clarity came a corresponding escalation in the family's efforts to deflect and obscure. It wasn't always a dramatic confrontation. Often it was a series of small, almost imperceptible abrasions, each one chipping away at my trust, revealing a deeper disrespect for the historical truth that lay beneath the polished surface of our family narrative. One particularly jarring instance involved the promised preservation of the old plantation ledgers. For generations, these dusty, leather-bound books, filled with meticulous script detailing harvests, purchases, and yes, the names of the enslaved people, had been held in a locked cabinet in my grandfather's study. They were frequently referenced in hushed tones as proof of the family's excellent record-keeping and diligent management. I remembered my grandfather, a man of stern but seemingly fair demeanor, once telling me that these ledgers were a sacred trust, a direct link to our past that must be safeguarded for future generations. He had even, in a rare moment of sentimentality, extracted a fragile page for me to examine, showing me the elegant script and the detailed entries. However, after his passing, when I inquired about accessing them for my budding research into local history, a seemingly innocuous request, I was met with a perplexing series of excuses. First, they were misplaced during the estate inventory. Then they were too fragile to handle. Finally, a cousin with a dismissive shrug informed me they had likely been discarded during a spring cleaning by an overzealous estate manager. The explanation felt hollow, a flimsy veil over a deliberate act. The casualness of their supposed loss, especially given their previously stated significance, struck me as a profound betrayal. It wasn't just the loss of historical documents. It was the casual disregard for the very history they claimed to cherish. This wasn't an oversight. It felt like an intentional erasure, a convenient disappearance of records that might tell a story inconvenient to the established narrative. The very idea that such precious heirlooms so integral to the Haven's legacy could simply vanish without a trace, without a single family member raising an alarm, sent a shiver of suspicion down my spine. It was a broken promise, not just to me, but to the past itself, and it left a sour taste in my mouth, deepening the cracks in my perception of our family's integrity. These painful silences became more pronounced, more pointed, as my inquiries persisted. I would ask specific questions, armed with snippets of information I'd gleaned from local archives or distant relatives, hoping to fill in the blanks. What about the yellow fever epidemic of 1852? The town records show a significant loss of life at the Haven. How did the family manage it? The response would often be a strained smile, a quick glance between family members, and then a pivot to a safer topic. Oh, that was a terrible time for everyone, dear. But let's not dwell on such sad things. Aunt Martha just made her famous pecan pie. The change of subject was always swift, almost practiced, designed to shut down any line of questioning that threatened to disturb the placid surface. It was a form of emotional aggression, subtle yet potent, a way of minimizing my concerns and implying that my interest in these historical nuances was somehow inappropriate or morbid. The message was clear. Certain aspects of our history were simply not open for discussion, not to be probed, not to be examined too closely. The gaslighting began subtly, insidiously, when I persisted, bringing up discrepancies I'd found in old county records versus the family's oral traditions. I was often met with a patronizing tone. "You're overthinking it," my uncle would say, a kindly smile masking a dismissive edge. "History is so complicated, and memories get muddled. You're being too hard on our ancestors. They did the best they could in their time." My concerns were reframed as an act of disrespect, an ungrateful questioning of the very people who had built our family's prosperity. It was implied that my pursuit of negative truths was a personal failing, a lack of loyalty, rather than a genuine desire for understanding. This emotional manipulation was designed to make me doubt my own perceptions, to question the validity of my research, and to ultimately silence me. I began to feel a profound sense of isolation, as if I were speaking a different language than my family, one that acknowledged the shadows while they insisted only on the light. The deliberate omission of details from public-facing historical accounts became increasingly evident, particularly as local historical societies, heavily influenced by our family's financial contributions and social standing, prepared new exhibits or publications about the Haven. I noticed the careful curation of photographs, always featuring the grand house, the manicured gardens, the smiling family members. Never a glimpse of the labor that built it, never a face that hinted at hardship. The narratives presented were always sanitized, emphasizing innovation and community spirit, while conveniently glossing over the human cost. The embellishment of benevolent stories reached almost farcical levels. Tales of my great-great-grandfather personally tending to the sick, or of generous provisions made for the workers, were repeated ad nauseum, often without any corroborating evidence, serving only to reinforce the illusion of a perfect paternalistic past. It was a conscious effort, a carefully constructed narrative designed to maintain the illusion of perfection, not just for the family, but for the entire community that had come to embrace the Haven as a symbol of their shared, untroubled heritage. This continuous emotional corrosion, this relentless chipping away at my faith in the family's honesty, had a profound effect. I felt the weight of the suppressed truth pressing down on me, a heavy, suffocating blanket that obscured the past and distorted the present. The deliberate efforts to maintain the facade were no longer just passive resistance. They felt like active deception, a conspiracy of silence perpetuated across generations. My initial unease had solidified into a quiet determination. The gentle skepticism had hardened into a resolve to find the complete story, to uncover the hidden layers of the Haven's past, no matter how uncomfortable the revelations might be. The beautiful stories, once comforting, now felt like a heavy cloak, hiding something vital and unsettling beneath. And I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within my bones, that I could no longer stand by and allow the truth to remain buried. The emotional toll was immense, but it also forged a steely will within me, preparing me for the battles ahead. I understood that the fight for historical honesty would not be an easy one, but it was a fight I was now undeniably committed to wage, for the sake of those whose stories had been erased, and for the integrity of the truth itself. The facade had to fall. The quiet internal struggle, that nascent quest for an unvarnished truth, did indeed begin to define my path forward, but it was not a solitary journey for long. My persistent, increasingly pointed inquiries, once subtle and easily dismissed, began to push against the unspoken boundaries that had long enclosed our family's narrative and, by extension, the entire community's carefully curated perception of the Haven. What started as a personal quest for understanding soon rippled outwards, disturbing the placid surface of our small southern town, revealing the deep-seated emotional investment everyone held in the myth of perfection. Discussions with family members, which had previously been characterized by polite deflections and uncomfortable silences, now evolved into increasingly heated arguments. The gentle probes I once employed were replaced by direct questions, fueled by a growing impatience and a sense of moral urgency. I would bring up inconsistencies I'd uncovered in old local newspapers, or discrepancies in the oral histories passed down through generations. My mother, usually the epitome of Southern grace, would grow visibly agitated, her hands fluttering dismissively as she accused me of digging up old bones and disrespecting our ancestors. My father, typically more reserved, would become uncharacteristically stern, his brow furrowed with a mixture of concern and irritation. "Some things are better left undisturbed, child," he would say, his voice low and firm, a clear warning. It wasn't just about protecting the family name. It was about protecting a core identity, a foundational story that had been told and retold, shaping who they believed they were. The emotional stakes were incredibly high, and my questions, innocent as they felt to me, were perceived as direct assaults on their very sense of self. Beyond the immediate family, social pressures began to emerge, insidious and pervasive. It started subtly, with quiet judgments from neighbors and longtime community members, who perceived my research not as a search for truth, but as an attack on local heritage. At church potlucks, conversations would fall silent as I approached. Friendly smiles would tighten, and invitations to social gatherings, once frequent, became conspicuously absent. I noticed the way eyes would follow me when I walked through the town square, a sense of being watched, of being whispered about, growing heavier with each passing week. The casual greetings from shopkeepers became brusque, the easy camaraderie with childhood friends replaced by an awkward distance. It was a soft ostracization, a subtle freezing out that was far more effective than any overt confrontation. No one directly accused me of anything, but the message was clear. I was rocking the boat, challenging the comfortable narratives that bound us all together, and I was not welcome in the same way I once was. This atmosphere of suspicion and isolation created a psychological environment around me that became heavy and suffocating. The air in our town, once vibrant with the warmth of community, now felt thick with unspoken disapproval. Every interaction became a test, every casual remark potentially laden with hidden meaning. I found myself constantly analyzing glances, interpreting tones of voice, feeling an invisible weight pressing down on me. It was as if the collective denial of the community had taken on a tangible form, a suffocating blanket woven from years of selective memory and willful ignorance. The weight of the suppressed history, combined with the community's fierce resistance to its unveiling, bore down on me, making every step forward feel like wading through thick mud. The haven, once a source of pride, now felt like a cage, its beautiful facade a cruel deception. The antagonist in this unfolding drama had truly expanded. It was no longer just the idealized family myth, the romanticized legacy of a benevolent plantation. It had become the collective denial and resistance of the entire social fabric, a powerful, invisible force field erected by generations of shared delusion. The very institutions that were meant to foster community, the historical society, the local church, even casual social circles, now seemed to conspire, unwittingly or not, to maintain the fiction. I realized that challenging this narrative was not merely a historical excavation, it was a cultural rebellion. I was not just questioning a few dusty facts, I was dismantling a cornerstone of their collective identity, and they were fighting back with the most potent weapons they possessed: silence, judgment, and exclusion. This period was marked by a profound sense of loneliness, a growing chasm between my internal convictions and the external world. I would spend hours poring over old documents in the town archives, feeling the eyes of the librarian on me, a mixture of curiosity and apprehension in her gaze. I'd visit relatives, hoping for a sliver of truth, only to be met with carefully constructed anecdotes that sidestepped any real substance. Each dead end, each averted gaze, each subtle slight, solidified my resolve even further. The more they resisted, the more I understood the depth of the secret they were protecting, and the more urgent my quest became. The truth, I knew, was not just hidden, It was actively suppressed, and that suppression itself spoke volumes. The psychological toll was immense, but it also forged a steeliness within me, an unyielding determination to see this through, no matter the cost to my standing in the community or my relationships with those I loved. The air was thick with the unsaid, and I could feel the tension building, a silent pressure cooker on the verge of eruption. I was an outsider now, standing alone against a tide of collective memory, but I was also closer than ever to understanding why that memory had been so meticulously crafted and so fiercely protected. My heart ached for the lost connections, for the comfort of unquestioning acceptance. But a deeper, more profound imperative drove me forward, towards the inevitable confrontation that lay ahead. The weight of generations of falsehoods was heavy, but the promise of truth, however painful, felt heavier still, pulling me relentlessly towards the light. The quiet internal struggle, the nascent quest for an unvarnished truth, had indeed defined my path forward, but that path was about to collide head-on with an increasingly aggressive and desperate defense of the entrenched myth. The subtle evasions and polite deflections I had grown accustomed to began to morph into more overt acts of obstruction, revealing the true depth of fear and complicity that underpinned the perfect plantation narrative. It was no longer a matter of simply overlooking inconvenient details. It was a concerted effort to actively suppress any and all evidence that might challenge the carefully constructed facade. The guardians of the haven's sanitized history, once content with merely changing the subject, now moved with a determined, almost frantic energy to protect their version of the past. My inquiries, once met with a dismissive wave, now triggered palpable anxiety. When I sought access to the plantation's old ledgers, rumored to contain detailed records of expenditures and labor, I was met with a bewildering array of excuses. They were misplaced, under renovation, or too fragile to handle. The family archives, once a source of innocent curiosity, suddenly became a fortress. Boxes I remembered seeing in the attic during my childhood were conspicuously absent, their contents conveniently forgotten. The family's official historian, a distant cousin named Arthur, who had always been amenable to discussing the more palatable aspects of our lineage, suddenly became evasive. His once encyclopedic knowledge of our ancestors' lives inexplicably failing him when questioned about anything pre-1865. He would clear his throat, adjust his spectacles, and launch into lengthy, irrelevant anecdotes about distant relatives, his eyes darting away from mine, betraying the discomfort he felt under my persistent gaze. It was a silent, psychological battle, with every denied request and every obfuscated answer serving as a brick in the wall they were constructing around the truth. This escalation reached its apex during a particularly tense family dinner, an annual gathering meant to celebrate our shared heritage. Great-Aunt Eleanor, the matriarch who had always wielded her influence with a cool, aristocratic grace, had become increasingly agitated by my continued meddling, as she termed it. Her usual porcelain smile was thinner, her eyes sharper. As I casually mentioned a desire to digitize some of the older family letters, a seemingly innocuous project, Eleanor's composure finally fractured. She slammed her hand, not violently, but with a sharp, decisive thud onto the polished mahogany table, silencing the room. "There are some things, dear, that are better left undisturbed," she stated, her voice low but laced with an undeniable steel. "Our ancestors deserve their peace, and our family, its reputation." It wasn't a suggestion, it was a command, delivered with the full weight of her authority. Her gaze was unwavering, a warning shot fired across the bow. Later that evening, she cornered me in the parlor, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was far more chilling than any shout. "You must understand," she began, her hand gripping my arm with surprising strength, "that some truths, once unearthed, can cause irreparable damage, not just to the past, but to the present, to all of us. There are people, influential people, who have a vested interest in things remaining as they are. Think carefully about the consequences of your actions, for yourself and for the family name. It was a veiled threat, perfectly disguised as concerned advice, a chilling intimation that my quest for truth was not only unwelcome, but potentially dangerous. The air grew thick with unspoken implications, a suffocating blanket of pressure designed to make me retreat. This incident, more than any other, marked my breaking point. The last vestiges of my patience and understanding for those who insisted on perpetuating the lie evaporated. I had tried to be respectful, to approach the subject with sensitivity, to give them the benefit of the doubt. But Eleanor's thinly veiled threat, her willingness to protect a fabricated history at any cost, solidified my resolve. It was no longer about historical accuracy. It was about confronting a deeply ingrained system of denial and the emotional aggression used to maintain it. The benevolent facade had finally crumbled, revealing the hardened, unyielding core of resistance beneath. I looked at Eleanor, seeing not a protective matriarch, but a defender of an indefensible lie, a gatekeeper of a harmful silence. My heart hardened with a quiet fury, a righteous indignation that burned away any lingering hesitation. The tension in the air around me became palpable, almost a living entity. Every casual conversation felt like a minefield, every family gathering a silent battleground. I could feel the eyes on me, the whispers that followed my movements, the collective unease my presence now generated. The haven, once a symbol of my heritage, now felt like a cage, its beautiful grounds and stately manner hiding a dark secret that everyone implicitly understood but refused to acknowledge. I was no longer merely curious. I was an antagonist in their carefully constructed drama, a disruptive force threatening to unravel generations of comfortable deceit. I knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within my bones, that I was on the cusp of a major confrontation. Something monumental was about to be revealed, something that would tear through the fabric of our family and community, exposing the raw, unvarnished truth for all to see. The photograph, still a silent witness in its dusty album, was about to find its voice, and I was prepared to be its conduit, no matter the cost. The quiet pursuit had ended. The battle for truth was about to begin. The silent witness, that fragile piece of photographic paper, had patiently held its devastating secret for generations, tucked away in the dusty confines of a forgotten album. But its silence was now broken, its time for quiet observation over. My resolve, hardened by Eleanor's veiled threats and the family's entrenched denial, propelled me into a relentless, almost obsessive pursuit of its full story. This was no longer just about curiosity. It was about giving voice to the voiceless, about shattering a meticulously crafted illusion that had suffocated truth for far too long. I spent weeks, then months, immersed in archives, poring over brittle ledgers, faded deeds, and obscure local newspaper clippings. I sought out descendants of families who had lived on or near the haven, those whose histories might offer a different perspective, often met with wary silence or hesitant whispers. Each fragmented piece of information was a thread, carefully pulled and woven, slowly revealing a tapestry far darker than I could have imagined. My research led me down forgotten paths, through the neglected corners of local history. I found census records that listed individuals with only first names, their lives reduced to a single line item, but their ages and presumed relationships hinting at familial bonds. I cross-referenced these with old plantation inventories, chilling documents that quantified human beings as property, detailing their monetary value, and sometimes, disturbingly, their condition. It was a dehumanizing process to read, yet essential to understand the full scope of what had been hidden. I discovered fragmented oral histories, passed down through generations of the Black community, stories of hardship and resilience that stood in stark contrast to the idyllic tales spun by my own ancestors. These narratives, often whispered and guarded, provided crucial context, lending names and faces to the anonymous figures I was beginning to discern in the faded photograph. The image, once a mystery, began to resolve into a horrifying clarity, each detail a punch to the gut. The photograph, I now understood, was taken in the late 1850s, a period of heightened tensions leading up to the Civil War. It depicted not a scene of harmonious labor or benevolent oversight, as the family lore would have claimed, but a raw, unembellished moment of profound cruelty. The central figures were three enslaved individuals, two men and a woman, shackled together at the ankles, their faces etched with a weariness that spoke of endless toil and profound despair. Behind them stood an overseer, his face obscured by shadow, but his posture undeniably menacing, a whip coiled casually in his hand. What truly delivered the devastating blow was the background, a newly constructed stable, its timber fresh and unweathered. A building whose completion was often celebrated in our family's historical accounts as a testament to the haven's prosperity. The stable wasn't built by willing hands. It was built by forced labor, under the shadow of violence, its construction a symbol of oppression, not progress. The photograph captured the very essence of the perfect plantation myth, a beautiful facade built upon the broken backs and stolen lives of others. This wasn't just a generic image of slavery. It was our plantation, our ancestors' cruelty, undeniably captured. I had matched the stable's unique architectural features to blueprints I'd found in our own family archives, cross-referenced the overseer's uniform style with contemporary descriptions, and chillingly, even identified one of the enslaved men. His name was Samuel, a man whose lineage I had painstakingly traced through those fragmented records, a man whose descendants still lived in the nearby town, often working on lands that once belonged to the haven. The photograph wasn't just evidence. It was a ghost, brought back to life, demanding recognition. The emotional impact was overwhelming, a torrent of shame, anger, and a burning conviction that this truth could no longer be contained. The idealized narrative, once a comforting blanket of heritage, now felt like a suffocating shroud, a lie that had permeated every aspect of my upbringing. The decision of how to reveal this truth weighed heavily. A public announcement felt too impersonal, too easy for my family to dismiss as an attack from an outsider. No, this needed to be a direct confrontation, an unyielding presentation of evidence that they could not ignore, could not reinterpret, could not deny. I called a family meeting, ostensibly to discuss the future of the haven's historical preservation, a topic I knew would draw out the most ardent defenders of the myth, Eleanor among them. The air in the grand parlor, usually filled with polite chatter and the clinking of teacups, was thick with an unspoken tension as everyone gathered. Eleanor sat opposite me, her expression a careful mask of composed suspicion. Other relatives, some genuinely curious, others clearly apprehensive, filled the room, their eyes occasionally darting towards me, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. The stage was set, the silence before the storm almost unbearable. I began calmly, speaking of the importance of accurate history, of honoring all who contributed to the haven's past. Then, with a deliberate slowness that commanded attention, I produced the photograph. It was carefully mounted, laminated to protect its fragility, yet its raw power was undiminished. I held it up, allowing everyone to see the faded sepia tones, the stark reality of the scene. A gasp rippled through the room. Eleanor's face, usually so controlled, contorted in a fleeting grimace of shock and disbelief, a crack in her formidable facade. Others stared, their eyes wide, some recoiling slightly as if struck. The image was undeniable, a stark visual contradiction to every romanticized story, every carefully chosen anecdote, every whitewashed narrative they had ever been told and had themselves perpetuated. "This," I stated, my voice steady despite the tremor in my hands, "is the truth of the haven. This is Samuel, and these are others, enslaved individuals, building the very stables we celebrate as a symbol of our prosperity. This is not a distant, anonymous past. This happened here. This was our family." I then laid out the corroborating evidence, the census records, the inventory lists, the architectural blueprints, the oral histories. I spoke of Samuel by name, of his family, of the injustice. I didn't accuse, I merely presented the facts, allowing the photograph and the documents to speak for themselves, their silent testimony far more powerful than any fiery rhetoric. The room fell into a stunned, horrified silence, broken only by a choked sob from a younger cousin. The truth, long buried, had exploded into the present, a definitive turning point that shattered the comfortable illusion of generations. The emotional trajectory of our family's story had irrevocably shifted, marking the undeniable, chilling triumph of truth over fabrication. There was no going back. The lie had been exposed. The Haven and all who called it heritage would never be the same. The battle, once a quiet internal struggle, had exploded into a public spectacle. The moment I unveiled the photograph, not just the image itself, but the meticulously researched, undeniable narrative behind it. The names, the dates, the specific acts of cruelty and systemic oppression that had been whitewashed from our history. A seismic shockwave ripped through the foundation of everything we thought we knew. It wasn't a gentle ripple. It was a violent tremor, shaking the very ground beneath the feet of every family member, every town elder, every citizen of a community steeped in a century of carefully constructed myth. The silence that followed my presentation was deafening, heavy with the weight of shattered illusions, before it erupted into a cacophony of immediate, intense consequences. Eleanor, predictably, was the first to react, her face a mask of furious denial, contorted by a raw, visceral betrayal. She rose, trembling, her voice a sharp, cutting whisper that carried across the stunned room, accusing me of slander, of dishonoring our ancestors, of tearing apart the very fabric of our family for some perverse need for attention. Her words were laced with venom, painting me as a destructive force, an ungrateful child intent on burning down the legacy she had so fiercely protected. Other relatives followed suit, some echoing her outrage, their faces flushed with anger and shame. They saw not truth, but an attack, a personal affront to their identities, their inherited pride dissolving into bitter resentment. They spoke of loyalty, of the dangers of digging up old wounds, of the irreparable damage I had wrought. Their eyes, once filled with the comfortable affection of kinship, now held a cold, unwavering hostility, a chasm opening between us that felt too wide to ever bridge. But amidst the furious condemnation, there were other, more complex reactions. My elderly aunt, a woman who had always been a quiet observer, sat hunched in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her gaze, when it met mine, was not of anger, but of profound, aching sorrow. A single tear traced a path down her wrinkled cheek, and though she said nothing, her silent acknowledgment spoke volumes. It was a wordless apology, a shared burden of a truth too long suppressed, and in that moment I felt a strange, unexpected connection, a quiet understanding that transcended the immediate chaos. A few younger cousins, previously ambivalent or vaguely uncomfortable with the family narrative, looked at the photograph with a dawning horror, their faces pale, their expressions a mix of shock and a nascent, unfamiliar shame. For them, it was not just history, but a reevaluation of their own identity, a sudden, brutal awakening to the privilege and complicity woven into their heritage. They grappled with the uncomfortable reality, their silence a testament to the internal struggles already beginning. The community's reaction was a maelstrom of conflicting emotions and fierce debates that quickly spilled beyond the confines of our family gathering. The local newspaper ran headlines that were sensationalist and divisive, fueling public outcry. "The Haven's dark secret unveiled," one blared, while another countered with, "Family feud threatens town's heritage." Neighbors who had once greeted me with warmth now averted their gazes or engaged in hushed, pointed conversations when I passed. The town square, usually a place of easy camaraderie, became a battleground of opinions. Some fiercely defended the old narrative, clinging to the comforting myth of the perfect plantation as a cornerstone of their identity, accusing me of trying to rewrite history with a malicious agenda. They attempted to discredit my findings, questioning my methods, my sources, even my sanity, desperate to preserve their idyllic vision. Yet there were others, a growing chorus of voices who expressed outrage and a profound sense of betrayal. Descendants of those historically marginalized, whose stories had been systematically silenced, found validation in the photograph. They came forward, sharing their own oral histories, their own fragments of truth that had been dismissed as mere folklore. Historians from nearby universities, once hesitant to challenge the entrenched local narrative, now reached out, eager to collaborate, to re-examine archives, to finally tell a more complete and accurate story. The division was stark, tearing at the social fabric of the town, turning longtime friends into adversaries, and forcing everyone to confront uncomfortable questions about their collective past. Emotionally, I was adrift in a chaotic sea. The pain of the familial rifts was a deep, aching wound. The cold stares, the accusations, the palpable sense of betrayal from those I had once loved, left me feeling isolated and raw. There were moments of profound doubt, whispers in the dark suggesting I had gone too far, that the cost was too high. Yet beneath the pain, there was an undeniable, exhilarating relief. The burden of the truth, a weight I had carried for so long, had finally been shed. The suffocating silence had been broken, replaced by the messy, often painful, but ultimately freeing roar of collective reckoning. I felt a newfound, unwavering strength in my convictions, a quiet pride in having stood firm against immense pressure. The shock of the community's varied responses, from vitriol to quiet solidarity, was a constant reminder of the complex, often contradictory nature of human beings. But it also solidified my resolve. The social landscape around me, around the entire town, was irrevocably changed. The comfortable illusions were gone, replaced by a harsh, undeniable reality. This was not an ending, but a tumultuous beginning, the start of a difficult, painful, but ultimately necessary period of reckoning. The dust had not settled, it had only just been stirred, swirling in a vortex of conflicting emotions, challenging everyone to look beyond the myth and confront the complex, often brutal truth that lay beneath. The photograph, once a silent whisper, had become a thunderclap, and its echoes would reverberate through generations, demanding a new, honest understanding of our shared history.